everyone. I'm Kamini Sani, the director of the Museum of Art and Photography, or MAP, at Bangalore. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to the third edition of the Deep Dive. In this series, we present researchers, curators, designers, and historians from around the world, exploring ideas, objects, or concepts in depth, as the title suggests, and taking us on journeys across time and geographies. Before we proceed with today's talk, I would like to take a moment to remember that this is an extremely challenging time for us in India as we try to grapple with the current health crisis and the scale of the tragedy that we are seeing. We at MAP believe that now more than ever, art and culture become relevant, providing a space for healing, for refuge, for expression. Today, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Suk Kyong Lee, Senior Curator, International Art at Tate Modern, who will tell us more about the Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational, or HTRCT, and how it engenders curatorial questioning of the geopolitics of global art histories, as well as the museum's collections in a decolonial context. We live in an age where we are more connected and more aware of our global interdependence than ever before. But the world has always been a place of interrelatedness, and our histories are often more intertwined than we realize. In recognizing that there is more than one story, there's also need for us as institutions to uncover the untold, unseen narratives and to reflect on how we can come together to address global concerns while dealing with the local contexts and situations. Moving from older notions of the museum as the static repositories of history, MAP's own approach to our collections and exhibitions is lateral, where we look for connections across time periods and mediums and breaking down rigid divisions such as high art and low art. It is therefore a great pleasure for me to invite Dr. Suk Kyong Lee today to talk about how the HTRCT's work looks to push the boundaries of traditional curatorial narratives, in which we see both synergy and the opportunity for great learning. Suk has been heading the HTRCT for the last 3 years, a major research initiative for curatorial innovation, overseeing its strategic vision and associated programming. Prior to her role at Tate Modern, she was also a curator at Tate Liverpool and served as the commissioner and curator of the Korean Pavilion at the 56th Venice Biennale. A more detailed bio of her can be found in the chat box below. Just a quick note to the audience to please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to address your questions to the speaker, and these will be answered in the last 10 minutes of the session. On behalf of everyone at MAP, I would like to thank Suk for giving us her time and agreeing to participate in this session. I have a very special connection with the Tate, where I spent 3 months as a Brooks Fellow several years ago, and I have some very happy memories of that time. So it's great to have you here, Suk, as a representative of Tate for us. I would also like to thank Alka from Signable for supporting us with the Indian Sign Language interpretation today. And now it's over to you, Suk.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Kamini, and thank you all at the Museum of Art and Photography for inviting me to this very interesting occasion of talk. As Kamini also mentioned, my thoughts are also with the people in India who seem to be going through a very difficult and challenging time, and I do hope all the best is in the near future. And I do also believe that we can continue thinking around art and thinking around what art actually means in life in such a challenging time too. So I hope that this an hour of talk can give some different thoughts on our daily lives and slightly better sort of understanding of a bigger picture beyond our daily sort of struggles. So I will perhaps share my screen and sort of go through a presentation I prepared. And it's really about how we have sort of developed different kind of curatorial thinking at Tate as an institution, and how the sort of new ways of thinking around curatorial method could help us to further develop different visions of art history, but also the art practice as well. So let me just go through. So this is a view of Tate Modern recently. You can see the former power station, oil tank fueled power station on the left, and then the new addition of a further building, further gallery spaces on the right. And this new museum of Tate family was established in 2000, as some of you may even remember. And when it was sort of added in the Tate family of Tate Gallery, Tate Liverpool, and Tate St. Ives, London's Tate Gallery became Tate Britain, and then this new museum building became Tate Modern. So all these four galleries are what constitute Tate as galleries, and it has quite a sort of distinctive role in looking at particularly modern and international art. So Tate Britain also looks at modern and contemporary art. Actually, it has very large remit of historical, modern, and contemporary art for its activities, while Tate Modern looks at particularly 19th century onward, largely 20th century and present century international art practice. So we were using international as a term to understand what is beyond Britain. And then for the last 20 years, as Tate Modern was growing as an institution with a very particular identity, we heard a lot about global dimension of artistic practice and how everything around art was also very globally connected, was our understanding too. And transnational is really a term that's not entirely new or innovative in its word itself, but we are trying to use this term to distinguish and perhaps depart from what was sort of a remit of international or global understanding of art. So we are interested in artistic practice from across the world, and we want to show these artistic sort of achievements and artistic kind of expressions on an equal term. So what we use as a methodology of showing and presenting art is based on juxtaposition. So you might have heard that Tate Modern, when it first opened in 2000, began this very experimental way of presenting its collection. It was called thematic displays of the collection rather than chronological. So it's now quite common practice to see big museums like Tate to show artistic expressions without relying on chronology or art historical chronology. So it's not from 1900 to 2021 in a chronological order, but it kind of juxtaposes different time periods in its presentation. And what this juxtaposition as a displaying sort of model means is it acknowledges the multiplicity of artistic practice. Wherever they are coming from, they do have its presence, its identity, and its own place and time. And we want to really acknowledge those multiplicity without any hierarchical sort of orders, which also means that we are really interested in horizontal sort of side of art history as well. So when you think about art history in a Western or sort of Western European or North American centric ways, you are naturally sort of forced to think about what was the origin of particular form, such as Cubism or Expressionism or Minimalism. And you are, again, naturally tending to find similar sort of expressions in different cultures. But when you think about these sort of Western-centric art historical terms as just kind of an incidental suggestions or frames which don't need to be followed, you can see art history in a very different way. And as you see in this sort of slide of many different artists from different places. One artist on your sort of on the wall on the left is from Russia, former Russia, and all the photographs he's taken are from the 70s. And then on the floor of the gallery, you can see a map of Beirut from artist, the Lebanese artist, showing a place as a place to walk over and to interact with. And then on the right, you can see a painting of an artist, by an artist from sort of more very contemporary sort of take on different cities, especially in North Africa. So what I see that as like a methodology of juxtaposition really opens up to a way to understand artistic practice and their histories in a non-hierarchical, horizontal, and very lateral way. So I'll talk a little bit more about what this new research center really represent in our new inquiries to curatorial thinking. So Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational was established in January 2019. And this was really a kind of a different experiment in curatorial thinking to create a hub for art historical research, but also curatorial research around everything a gallery does. So a museum like Tate Modern has to do a lot of sort of new thinking around how we collect new works for the collection, how we develop a collection to a more transnational way, and also how we host and organize temporary exhibitions in that way too. And the way we use the collection is really to make them available as displays, what we term as displays. And these collection displays are really a very big chunk of our program that is known and exposed to our audience. As you, some of you may know very well, Tate galleries are all free, and especially the sort of spaces devoted to collection displays are largely free. And the spaces for temporary exhibitions are admission charged, but about 70% of Tate Modern's space, gallery space, is usually devoted to free collection displays. And they really tell many different sort of stories of art from across the world, and they convey many different messages curators and the museum as an entity really want to tell. So to look at different sides of curatorial expressions, I will talk a little bit about exhibition, and then collection building and its displays, and also how research sort of relate to these things that are really the expressions to our audiences. So when we think about the exhibitions, particularly these temporary exhibitions with a lot of loan-ins, like we would need to borrow a lot of works to organize these temporary exhibitions. And also we work quite closely with other institutions in many cases to make the exhibition to tour and to be presented in different places. And there are a lot of considerations to host these exhibitions. And probably the most important sort of part might be these art historical questions and revisions. And we are also sort of looking at sort of art history as an embedded kind of questioning. Maybe only curators and our peers are aware of these sort of very in-depth academic questions, but they are important, and we want to sort of build something new to the narratives around one particular artist, if it's a solo exhibition, and to a particular sort of discourse, if that is a thematic exhibition or group exhibition. And of course, we want to add something with very known artistic figures as well. So I will talk about sort of how we've approached known modern masters in this mixture of different exhibitions, and also how we really sort of engage with very current practices in certain cases too. So the balance and mixture of the program is very important to understand an institution's vision. And of course, what we are always very aware and very attentive to is the field of practice itself. So what's actually been produced and created by the artist are very important. We want to reflect and sort of truly be a platform for these different practices being produced from across the world as well. And the artists sort of changing views around certain locality or histories, they're very, very important for us to convey. So in these cases, we become, the museum itself becomes a kind of a platform for these different voices, and also curators becoming a mediator to truly convey what's been raised by these artists and their practice. And increasingly, we are also very aware of what's happening around us. So socially and politically, how these artistic practices can respond, and how they are actually engaged in these different aspects of our civic life. And with the the ongoing health crisis like we are now, and also with very sort of explosive awareness around racial inequality, also sort of give us a space to think, but also huge questions around how we used to work and how we sort of look at artistic practices in perhaps different contexts now. So that I will sort of say a little bit more with particular examples later. And another sort of balance we want to sort of consider is between local, regional, national, and transnational. So when you are thinking about certain issues, particularly like environmental issues or climate sort of crisis, or thinking about indigenous rights or racial inequalities, you can see how one particular place's problem also resonates with other parts of the world, and how certain sort of issues really do share the sort of similar origins of those causes, but also perhaps kind of collective solutions they demand. So we're looking at all this sort of different context of our positionality in thinking of mounting an exhibition now, perhaps more than ever. And of course, these are all about how visitors engage with those sort of narratives and stories. So artists create stories, museums and curators mount these exhibitions to convey and also sort of develop those voices. And then visitors come in and they experience and they engage with their own lived experiences and their perspectives. So when we talk about diverse and inclusive sort of audience reach, it's not just about, you know, demographics of the audience we're interested in, but their sort of collective lived experiences and how that really tells us about the stories of art as well. And of course, another thing we always think about is what legacy one exhibition could really leave. And as a collective, sort of a group of exhibitions for a museum, what does it really tell as a story? So we are always conscious of these things, and it may be something not quite exposed to our audience, but certainly in certain cases, these conscious sort of direction of our mission really becomes a key figure of an exhibition project. So I will talk some examples, not in too much detail, but some examples of different textures of exhibition program. So the exhibition like Soul of a Nation was really quite a different thing for Tate Modern to host. And it had a very sort of key mission of really representing underexplored, underrepresented artists from a certain country. So it was about USA and artists from the US, but also about particular sort of ethnic identity, but also sort of subjectivity of all sorts that may have been under sort of explored in the past. And these things can be in a thematic exhibition like this, and how sort of a certain group of artistic practice has actually changed a nation's view of artistic practice, but also the society and the issues within that society. And we have seen, since this exhibition, we have seen how this sort of debate, this kind of debate still sort of operates as a key inquiry within that society too. So it's certainly not a finished discussion, but the debate and sort of examination continues in the nation, but also beyond that particular country. And the Namjoon Paek was the exhibition I curated in 2019 as one of the first sort of exhibitions that really look at transnational context of an artist's practice. Paek was a pioneer of video art, and we are all aware that what his practice meant in the relationship between art, science, and technology. But what has been sort of less known was his transnational practice. He was born in South Korea during the Japanese colonial period. Korea was under Japanese colonial power, and he was born in the middle of that sort of colonial period, and sort of saw how the country got divided into North and South with the impact of Cold War. And the country just became the sort of forefront of this power struggle between the First and Second World. And then when he sort of moved to Japan to avoid the Korean War, he was very aware how sort of this avant-garde practice from the West, largely from Europe at the time, was shaping a country's artistic practice in a place like Japan. So Japan was very aspirational to be like Western European countries and North America, and wanted to sort of have that power and influence around sort of artistic and cultural realms as well. And I suppose what he saw as a university student in Japan was that type of desire, but also his own sort of ambition to be that sort of avant-garde sort of artistic voice. And when he decided to move to West Germany to study further, his idea was really about getting very directly connected to what was happening as an experimental art practice. And he later moved to US, largely because the scientific and technological advances and their availabilities dictated. And these three continents, Asia, Europe, and North America, really became equal sort of places for him to get connected with his fellow artists. He was always very interested in collaboration as a way of artistic method, and also performative elements of artistic practice that was behind all his sort of performative but also technological experimentations. So this exhibition was about showing a less known artist to UK audience, but also with a very different reading of his work through different artist historical lens. And currently we have Zanel Muholi, South African artist whose sort of subjectivity questions and their own identity questions really resonate with a lot of people whose representation have been very, very much repressed. And when Tate Modern reopens next week, the audience will be able to see the final few weeks of this important exhibition. And this was also supported by HTRCT's adjunct curator, who is based in South Africa, who helps us to think about African art and its diasporic practice very differently. So I will talk a little bit more about it later, but such a sort of contribution from our collaborators are very, very important factor now. Rather than relying on in-house sort of full-time curators based in London, we want to connect with specialists, academics, curators, artists, practitioners, and activists in different parts of the world directly, and really making their voices available to our network of audiences too. And an exhibition coming up at Tate Britain this December is around the art from the Caribbean. And the Caribbean sort of immigration history really tells an interesting side of British identity. And when we rethink what British art means in this time and place, it's very important to think about the effects and influences of migration and diaspora and their associated sort of histories of imperialist and colonial histories as well. So this is Michael Macmillan, the front room. And this will be one of the sort of works in the exhibition, but the exhibition really will look at this very intertwined histories between Britain and the Caribbean, and especially with sort of modern and contemporary figures who worked and lived across these two regions, and how their sort of personal histories also tell very, very important stories of art in both regions. And so that was more about the exhibitions. And if I can talk a little bit more about the collection, there are strategies for new acquisitions, and that's very much based on curators' research. Again, we have all these things I talked about, the first four, when we think about the sort of exhibition programming, but also we do rigorous research on provenance, valuation, and sort of the market in general. But there are some more things to consider, I know, for especially historic works. And of course, the sort of the provenance is really the question about where that particular artwork was sourced and how. And these things are very important, especially sort of pre-modern sort of works as well, but also some works, as we see in sort of repatriation of sort of Nazi era sort of objects as well. So these things are more like a due diligence for public institutions like Tate to consider and being responsible. But I think there will be more moral and ethical sort of questions around contemporary practice as well in the future. And these acquisition strategies are really for building a collection, but also building a collection means how to display them, how to present them to our audience in the manner that is relevant, but also that tells different sides of the stories without prejudice. So increasingly, I think we are aware of regions and chronologies, but we are getting away from that as really fixed kind of frame. So we do know, and we are very sort of respectful of regional context when a work is acquired, and also where that was made and what time period that was sort of created is also very important. But they are more of reference points. And based on those things, we can then think about more creative ways of and more relevant ways of presenting them. So themes come up as very important part to reflect what's really important for our audiences as well as curators. So again, as I mentioned before, sort of fluid sexuality and sort of gender identities, also climate concerns, they become very relevant in all parts of the world. And we see different region-based acquisition committees to tackle and explore these quite similar sort of concerns, because that they are the kind of themes artists are very interested in exploring now. So these sort of different typologies work together, and curators are always rethinking what might be more relevant and more contemporary kind of ways of sharing these important artistic expressions. So I'll show just a few views of our collection displays, the sort of the free space I mentioned before, and how they look. And again, juxtaposition is our sort of main ways of triggering debate. So we don't want people to just learn about an artist or an artwork. We want our visitors to really appreciate it, just enjoy it, whichever degree they choose and they like to. And then we want them to be able to go deeper if they wish. And also we want to make them to think what these artistic sort of manifestations really mean to them. So it's not really being about didactic about what this artwork means. There is a sort of descriptive labels for each work, but usually what we try to do is to give enough information for any visitor to really to make their own mind about that particular subject. And if the form is sort of really the key concern for an artist, the message behind it may be a very different thing. And we want the artwork to speak itself, of course, but we want to give enough context and enough materials for our visitors to trigger further thoughts, because we do believe in this transformative moment. When you encounter an artwork, you see something, you get moved, and or you understand something really truly, and then those transformative experiences will help us to live our lives quite differently. And this is again when artistry becomes more prominent in our displays. This is a Gutai art display. Gutai was a Japanese art movement that was sort of very active in the sort of post-Second World War Japan. And since the sort of 50s and 60s, there were many artists associated with this Gutai group who were interested in sort of performative aspects of paintings, and in some cases, performance itself. So when they were understood as happenings or events or incidents, they were all quite very new in that context, but we just want to sort of show the historic moment of that movement in that sort of geographical context of Japan in one display. So there are a lot of archival materials to show how these documentations of such sort of performances happened, and also some other related materials you can look to understand why these sort of different artistic sort of expressions happened in certain sort of time frame. And we have very different spaces from like white cube or sort of black box style, and the very representative space is what's called the tanks. And these galleries are created in the sort of a real oil tank space of the former power station. So the architect who renovated the power station always wanted to leave and use these oil tank spaces, and the Tate sort of people also wanted it to be used in its own form. And now they are basically very much cleaned and then be sort of modified to be able to accommodate these new types of work that can sit somewhere between sculpture, installation, and performance. And it's important to think that we can show any collection works in different places and different contexts as well. So performance like these twins of work by Tunga happens in just different parts of the gallery. So they can happen on the bridge like this between two different buildings, and it can happen in a gallery. And we don't want to just confine performances or any artistic sort of or any medium specific artworks to just given space. So things are always happening and a little bit unexpectedly, so that again the visitors experience artworks in very different sort of ways as well. And sort of, so I will talk a little bit more how this type of research center, HTRCT, can relate to what we've seen previously in exhibitions and displays and collection building. So we are directly involved in developing and facilitating these exhibitions and displays program. And that was why this particular research center was established within Tate Modern's curatorial team. So I'm heading it, but the whole department is really the team. So any curator, assistant curator, or senior curator can lead a project, which can be an exhibition or collection display or public program like seminars, talks, or symposia. And they can also be the lead curator of a digital content like an artist's film, artist's interview, or an animated content for particular age groups. And also we are all making these sort of programs in partnership with somebody in many cases. So I'll talk a little bit about exhibition based on the collection I'm working on, A Year in Art, Australia, 1992. So this will happen early June, next month. So I'll be installing this from next week. Very excited to go back to the gallery after so many months of closure. But we also, due to that closure, we had a bit more time to think about this exhibition and its floor plan and all these things. So it will happen in the sort of old building, Natalie Bell building, level 3 East Gallery. And I'm working with my colleagues, Valentina Ravaglia and Tamsin Hong, for this exhibition, because I've been sort of responsible for acquiring contemporary works from Australia for the past 4 years. And as part of sort of Asia Pacific region, I was sort of assigned to look at Australia within that region's context, but also with what we've been looking at within the Tate Modern's curatorial team. So indigeneity and sort of people's experience, especially around land rights and civic rights of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, island people's sort of life was really quite an interesting subject from very beginning of that particular acquisition project. And the HTRCT has been also developing indigenous sort of discourse as one of our research priorities. So we have sort of established a post of adjunct curator for that inquiry. And also we have sort of colleagues from Australia now working at Tate, also sharing their own sort of lived experiences and their kind of slightly different understanding of the topic as well. So what we have sort of decided to show very prominently is this hugely historic and long sort of artistic tradition. Almost 65,000 years of artistic tradition that hasn't been disrupted until the colonial sort of invasion. And we're showing 3 contemporary artists, John Marunjo and Emily Kameware and Dale Harding, to use their own sort of traditional techniques from their own communities. And they are all sort of different custodians of their own cultures, because there are more than 300 different countries in Australian continent, and they have different languages and different cultures and different understandings of the sort of nature as well. So they have developed their own traditional sort of artistic languages, and we are sort of looking at this through the contemporary practice. So this ongoing nature of traditional thinking was also a very important thing for us to represent. And then we are making a sort of quite sort of consciously sort of critical juxtaposition between Algernon Talmadge and Gordon Bennett. So Gordon Bennett was a very important artist who looked at different heritages within many Australians, especially a mixture of sort of European heritage and also Aboriginal heritage, and himself being that sort of mixed heritage artist, he was very interested in sort of this mythical construction of Australia as an identity. And artists like Algernon Talmadge, the British artist working in the early 20th century, looked at Australian sort of founding of Australia as a nation entirely through British colonial perspective. And we wanted to really show what was the sort of the thinking behind this mythical construction of images, but also what was actually the real sort of stories behind this mythology and sort of constructed narratives as well. And racial sort of tensions between different communities in Australia also became a very important thing for us to highlight. And works like Vanunaki's Tall Men will be included in the exhibition to show some sort of resonances, what's happening in the States, for instance, and UK, and what's happening in a sort of very small island of Brisbane in Australia as well. So just to wrap up, I will talk a little bit about how we use public programs such as this and also other sort of digital content. So we organize a large-scale international symposium per year, and usually with some partners as well. And our lectures and seminars take in many different forms, such as Otobong Nkanga, who was showing at Tate St. Ives at the time, gave a performance lecture, Tate Modern, with us. And we also commission and create many different digital contents, and such as written interviews with artists or animated film for our sort of younger audiences as well. And sometimes to really talk about particular themes or concept, we make a film like the one in the making sense of a place, how artists map a transnational world. And because events are usually in person or on digital form, but not many people can really sort of see them, we want to sometimes leave the legacies of those events by reflections of that event by other writers. So we share after the event these reviews and reflections about that particular sort of content. And social media, of course, is a very important thing for us to be part of. And Tate has many departments and many different messages to convey. So it can be quite sometimes very overwhelming, but we work very closely with the responsible team to make sure that important messages through this HTRCC activities are also sort of transferred to our biggest sort of wide audience as well. And more in-depth works behind the scene, perhaps, is reworking of art terms. And we are starting with very few sort of terms, but we understand that our sort of texts and things on our website can be very sort of authoritative in many ways for researchers and students across the world. So we feel very responsible to be at the forefront of telling and reframing these art terms as well. And collaborations, as I mentioned, many different museums and academic institutions, and also individuals we work with. So many sort of outcomes are shared between these different institutions. And because of those partnerships, we can really have different specialisms beyond our sort of staff capacity as well. So the one annual symposium coming up this December is Consent Not to Be a Single Being, World in the Caribbean. We're working with a sort of network of different universities of art historical departments to look at that particular region as a way to think about different ways of worlding. And as I mentioned previously, we have adjunct curators working in different ways. So First Nations and Indigenous art, Caribbean diasporic art, African diaspora. So these specialists based in different locations are connected to us with different explorations. So their inquiries with existing Tate staff will become sometimes acquisitions and sometimes exhibitions, and in many cases, many different seminars and written materials as well. So I'll leave to more questions and comments. So I'll just look at some Q&As. Somebody asked, Kamlesh, thank you for the question. So you asked whether we have artist in residency program. And the quick answer is no, but we work very closely with other agencies, not in a sort of a very sort of formal way, but we are engaging with many artists through other programs, especially, I don't know whether you're aware that we have this program called Tate Exchange, where more than, a couple of hundreds associates are created in a year's program. So there are many different ways of artists now engaging with different parts of Tate. And while artist in residency program is important, we also acknowledge that our neighbors like Delphina and Guesswork also have this sort of capacity, and that's really what they do as the main and key activities. So we work very closely with our neighbors and colleagues in London, and also where other sort of Tate galleries are. And Tate St. Ives actually have artist in residency program within their sort of program as well. So for Tate Modern, yes, it's a slightly different thing, but for Tate in general, there are some other ways, as well as a direct artist in residency program in St. Ives. And let's see. And exhibitions coming up with reference to India. There are actually. We have quite a number of displays with artworks from India, and we have very ambitious and major display plan with Vivan Sundram. We acquired quite a substantial work from him a couple of years ago, and we're really trying to sort of ensure the right space and right time are allocated for that work. And also we had Atol Dodia display for some time. It's just gone uninstalled, but we had quite great sort of exposure to that particular artist for some time. And also we have Monica Correa works on display, and also Mukherjee, Merlini Mukherjee work on display as well. So, and I can also think of Gauri Gill, on display. So we wouldn't have it like India or particularly sort of India focused one display, but a lot of works, artworks by Indian artists are actually presently on display, making that very interesting global narratives. And yes, there was a question from Ankita. Can we expect to build transnational political solidarity through a transnational creation of art? I believe so. I really do hope so. And I think especially, as I mentioned, the sort of climate crisis very intertwined with decolonial questions. And as we all know, indigenous sort of survival is also very much about the sort of planetary effort to fix it. And I would say transnational is a good way of making these sort of solidarities as our sort of core aim. And without that sort of frame of beyond nations and beyond national borders, we can't really build such solidarity kind of activist networks. So I do believe it's a useful term. I mean, there may be different ways to put it, but I do think transnational is definitely a frame designed to encourage solidarities and that sort of aligned kind of thinking. And so Janet asked, can you say something about considerations that go into the storage and reshowing of transitory artwork, visual and performance? Yes, we actually have a very focused and in-depth research project into reshaping the collectible. So we're looking at what is understood as collectible and what is understood as difficult to collect and impossible to collect. So the researchers around this project are really looking at very diverse range of material and immaterial context of artworks. So Tate was one of the first museums to collect performance as instructions into its collection. And it was quite a sort of a difficult procedure at first, but it was understood very quickly as a necessary step. And as I mentioned about sort of reflecting artistic practice and artistic field, really means that. So if there are works that are transitory in nature, we will have to think about ways of either collecting or presenting them, or both. So it's definitely something we keep relearning about and keep re-educating ourselves about.
Now that we're past time, Sue, thank you so much for giving us your time today and for walking us through, all of the curatorial innovative approaches that that you're working on at the HTRCT. I mean, now that most of the world is online and you're sort of also looking more and more at the digital space as the primary mode for interaction, or at least a significant avenue for interaction for museums, I think the role of building and creating relevant and creative solutions to curatorial and public programming becomes all the more relevant. So thank you for giving us a lot of food for thought, and thank you for the audience for staying in, and for Alka, who unfortunately had to drop off due to some technical problems, but helping us with the Indian Sign Language interpretation until then. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.